local public library is hosting a brewery history presentation. Fox 11's Allison Spotswood is learning all about it. She's live in Manitowoc. Good morning, Allie.
Good morning. Hi, guys. You guys, I am here at Pet School Brewing in Manitowoc, and we're learning all about the brewery history presentation that's happening later on today. And I got some of the presenters here with us this morning. They brought so many visuals out here for us to look at, too. So I'm excited about that, and what a beautiful brewery we're here at Pet School. This is Mike, and he is a RAR historian for the brewery presentation. So, Mike, let's learn about what you guys will be presenting on today and the history of the RARs in this area. Can you tell me about the family?
Sure. My speech is just with the RARs, and I talk about William and Natalie RAR right here.
Their information. Okay, so they moved here from where?
They came from Germany, city of Wessel in the Rhine region.
Very cool. And so they started their brewery here, but they were brewers before that, correct?
They were brewers in Germany to start out with. And he brought his craft here, and he opened up a brewery in 1847.
That's awesome. So their information and their entire family history is really cool. And your wife is actually a descendant of them, correct?
She is. She is the great-great-great-granddaughter of these two right here.
This is very cool. So is that how that got you into this kind of historic approach to things and being able to tell people about the presentation today?
Well, actually, I love Manitowoc history, anything, but having my wife be a RAR descendant has got me really going, and I started collecting as much as I could find.
So you guys can learn about the RARs and their history here, all of the breweries throughout the presentation today. That's actually from 6 o'clock to 7:30 p.m. at the Manitowoc Public Library later on tonight. I've also got Brett here with me, and he is a Kingsbury historian, and they have a huge history in this area as well. So let's learn about all of this brewery history with the Kingsbury specifically.
Okay, thank you. Well, as Mike alluded to, breweries like RARs were here, breweries like Schreihart, Kuhn's and Blazer, and these were all small breweries that were here. German immigrants came over here, and it is a large part of the culture in Manitowoc and Sheboygan counties. When Prohibition came along, these breweries coalesced into the Kingsbury Brewery.
And you were saying it is because of all of these, different families coming here from Germany, and you think that's why the brewery history kind of started in this area you guys were telling me about. So when people want to come out later on today, what can they get involved in at the Manitowoc Public Library?
Well, a lot of the items that you see here, and even more than that, will be displayed. You're going to be able to learn more about the economic impact that these breweries had and what a difficult struggle it was for them to survive Prohibition and then eventually become a national brand. For instance, I have a can here. You can tell by the bottle cap on it that this beer was brewed in Pennsylvania. For a short period of time, Kingsbury was a national brand. Eventually it became a regional brand, and unfortunately was swallowed up by larger brewers.
Well, thank you both for telling me a little bit about it. If you guys want to learn more about it this morning or this afternoon, you're going to have to come this evening to Manitowoc to learn more about it at the public library. I'll send it back for now. Come out from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Allie. Brewing today. Fox 11's Allison Spotswood is live in Manitowoc, learning more about tonight's presentation. Good morning, Allie.
Hey, good morning, guys. Yeah, I am here at Pet School Brewing, and I've learned about the brewing company here and their presentation that's going on tonight at the Manitowoc Public Library. I've got some historians that are speaking to me now. I've got Mike here, and he is a RAR historian. So, Mike, you were telling me about just the RAR location here and how it's connected to Northeast Wisconsin. Tell me more about it.
Well, William RAR was so successful with his brewery in Manitowoc, his nephews came over from Germany, and Henry RAR built a brewery in Green Bay, and his other nephew built a brewery in Oshkosh. So the whole area was RARs at one time.
It was all very connected to each other, and they started things, right? So we'll really be able to go through the centuries even here, starting with 1847 through today's day and age of the brewery history at the public library tonight. And you're one of the presenters. How will we be able to do that?
Well, I will start out with first of all, we'll say how they came from Germany to Wisconsin, and then I will talk about RARs, and then Brett will segue into Kingsbury breweries and go through that speech with us.
Very cool. So you guys, this is multiple breweries that actually led into Kingsbury, and that presentation is going on at the Public Library here in Manitowoc tonight from 6 to 7:30 p.m. So Brett's here with me. He is a Kingsbury historian as well. Brett, you're going to be here presenting tonight. What can we learn about as far as bringing it through the decades, bringing it through the centuries, and learning about the history of brewmaking here in Wisconsin?
Well, particularly in the Manitowoc and Sheboygan areas, Kingsbury was a very recognizable brand. Even today, it hasn't been brewed in over 50 years, but there are high-end condos in Sheboygan right now that still use the Kingsbury logo in their marketing. And if you walk around Manitowoc, you will see people wearing T-shirts like this, hats. I even know people who have Kingsbury tattoos, for crying out loud.
There is so much history here, especially in Wisconsin. Some of these different breweries led into the Kingsbury name that it is today. But let's talk about maybe how some of this history kind of goes over time, where it started, how you think it'll kind of progress as we go through the future. You were even telling me about how it started here with a basement even in one of the local high schools that it is now today, where they used to brew beer because that's the only way they could do it back then.
Yes, back in the 1850s, when these fledgling breweries were starting, they had to be built on top of hills because there was no automation, there was no pasteurization, there was no refrigeration. So you built cellars into the sides of hills, and here in Manitowoc, the very largest hill is the site where Manitowoc Lincoln High School is today. So back in the 1850s, that was known as the John Refs Brewery.
The things I'm learning this morning. I mean, there's so much for you guys to come out and get involved in if you want to tonight at the Manitowoc Public Library. It's from 6 to 7:30 p.m. tonight. You don't have to register either. So come on out and you guys can get maybe some beer tastings and learn all about the history of beer making in Northeast Wisconsin. I'll send it back. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Allie.
Senator Devin Lemieux scheduled to be with us in about 15 minutes or so. But in the meantime, what we're going to do is talk beer. Beer and the library, they go together so well, don't they? It's natural. Joining me here this morning is, well, a man who's going to be leading up an interesting program coming up here in just a couple of days. Brett Blizzard is with us, our Kingsbury historian, if you will. How you doing, Brett?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me this morning. It's never too early to talk about Kingsbury beer in my book.
That's right. Well, the program is coming up in just a couple of days here. Manitowoc's brewery history, starting all the way back in 1847.
Correct.
Wow.
Yes.
How did it all start?
Well, the breweries in Manitowoc were the Charles Hottleman Brewery, which was founded in 1849. And in Sheboygan, the Gutch Brothers Brewery began in 1847. At some point around Prohibition, a lot of these small breweries coalesced and became Kingsbury. Kingsbury began brewing in Manitowoc in 1933. And by 1949, all of the brewing operations had moved to Sheboygan, but yet Kingsbury still remains a ubiquitous brand in Manitowoc. And after 150 years, they did go out of business, but I think it's important to keep the brand alive. So I'm happy to do my part.
Yeah, it's going to be a terrific program. Now, you have 4 major areas you're going to be talking about of the city's beer brewing history. What are these 4 areas?
Correct. First of all, the fellow who deserves a ton of credit for putting this all together, Joe Kazda, runs a website, ManitowocTavernHistory.org. If you're interested in the history of Manitowoc and its beer history, it's a wonderful website. It's very well written, very well researched, and comes in short bursts. I know you have a lot of options out there on the internet, but this is worth your time. So Joe will be talking about some of Manitowoc's brewing history. That will be followed up by my good friend Mike Disher, who will be talking about the history of Rahr's Brewery and Rahr's Malting here in the city. And of interest, Mike is married to a descendant of the Rahr family. So Mike will have a lot of history to go through with RARS, and then I'm going to follow with Kingsbury history. And quite frankly, I don't have a family member affiliated with Kingsbury. I'm just some knucklehead who really liked to drink Kingsbury.
So I was going to ask you, I said, are you some sort of a descendant here, or is it just, you're just a fan?
I'm just a fan.
Yeah.
Now that the statute of limitations has run out, I will admit that I probably had my first Kingsbury in high school and drank it pretty religiously throughout the 80s and 90s. And I began collecting Kingsbury memorabilia. I now have about 400 pieces in my basement. Amazingly, I'm still married. But the brand itself, I'm a marketing guy, and I just fell in love with the brand story. And I just think it's important that people remember the history that Kingsbury had here.
What are some of the little tidbits that you have in your house with Kingsbury logo on it?
Oh my gosh, where to even start? I have probably 10 lighted signs. I have every tap knob, or a variety of every tap knob they ever produced going back to the 20s. I have a lot of stuff for when they were known as Manitowoc products. I have items when they were known as the Coons Blazer and Company. Also some Schreihart Brewing pieces. And all these things coalesced into Kingsbury. Don't have a lot of wall space left, but hey, always looking.
We are here with Brett Blizzard this morning, our local Kingsbury historian. In 2 short days, we got November the 1st at the Manitowoc Public Library. It's Manitowoc Brewery History from 1847 to 2023, and I believe this starts at 6 o'clock. Is that right?
It does. 6:30 to 7:30, and I would like to also point out that after I'm done with my Kingsbury presentation, Ron Schroeder of Brees Malting, he's their director of marketing, and he has a really great piece on the history of Brees Malting and their role here in Manitowoc, so definitely want to mention that. But it's an hour and a half. I'm basically going to run through 150 years of history in my 20-minute portion, so Back to the Future's got nothing on me.
Have you done this before, a presentation like this before?
Not on Kingsbury, so I'm very excited to do it. But as a marketing guy, I've done presentations.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But between your marketing history and your obvious interest in Kingsbury,
yes,
I'm sure you're going to come prepared.
Chances are likely I will. I will be bringing a number of brewery pieces for display. I'm always available to answer any questions about Kingsbury. And July 31st of 1999 was probably the last day I cried. That's when they stopped brewing Kings.
Yeah. It has been a while now, hasn't it?
It unfortunately has, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, well, our beer history, our Manitowoc brewing history, 1847 to 2023, again coming up in 2 short days at 6 p.m. Is this program, is it upstairs?
It is. It's upstairs in the Balkanski room.
Yeah.
There is no admission charge, and there is no registration. First come, first served. I can promise you that it should be a fairly entertaining evening. So if you want to come out and check out the wonderful resources that the library has, it should be a fun evening.
And there could be a special guest or two happening by, too. We'll have to see.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is very possible. Again, we have a number of things in store. It should be entertaining.
Again, all you do, just go in the library, walk up the stairs, and hang a sharp left, and you're right in the Balkanski room upstairs. It is, again, this Wednesday, 2 short days from now, 6 p.m. in the Balkanski room, the Manitowoc Brewery History. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Brett.
Craig, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You got it.
Alcoholism, largely fueled by Kingsbury beer. In 1981, this guy right here gave me my very first piece of Kingsbury memorabilia. It has led to this narcotic habit of buying Kingsbury memorabilia, and I now have about 400 pieces in my house. Amazingly, I'm still married. So tonight we're going to go on a fun 150-year history journey in the next 20 minutes. It's going to go fast, it's going to be wild, kind of bumpy, but let's keep it simple, right? I'm going to talk about three things tonight. The first is a chronology of the Kingsbury Brewing Company. It started before Wisconsin was even a state, and it somehow survived Prohibition before being gobbled up by a larger brewery. Secondly, why did Kingsbury fail? And is it really accurate to say that it failed? After all, it was actually once a national brand here in brewed in Manitowoc, and it successfully marketed itself as a low-price leader in beer. And lastly, why does the Kingsbury brand still endure? Truthfully, it hasn't been brewed in Manitowoc since 1949. It left Sheboygan in 1974, but here we are, and I'm looking around, and I can see all kinds of Kingsbury sweatshirts. I see Kingsbury hats. I know a couple guys in Howard's Grove that have Kingsbury tattoos. They're real. Seriously. And in Sheboygan, there is a Kingsbury Village. It's high-end condos, and they're still using the old Kingsbury logo to market their product. That's pretty incredible when you think that it hasn't been brewed in the city for over 50 years. It's a brand with some real lasting power. It's kind of cool. Okay. I just told you that Kingsbury was brewed in Manitowoc for only 16 years, 1933 to 1949. And I know you're thinking, what the heck kind of a Kingsbury historian are we listening to? The label clearly says since 1847. Okay, well, it wasn't called Kingsbury in 1847. The origins of the Kingsbury Brewery started in Sheboygan in 1847 by a pair of our twin brothers, Adolf and Leopold Gutsch, who started the Gutsch Brewery. They produced about 1,600 barrels annually. But since we're in Manitowoc, I'm going to concentrate strictly on the Manitowoc side of things, and that was the Charles Hottleman Brewery. That brewery began in 1849, right in the area of about 9th and Marshall. Hottleman was a key figure in the founding of the village of Manitowoc in 1851. He was certainly a trained German brewer. He only had 2 people on his staff. One of them was Albert Blatz. Obviously, Blatz's brother Valentin Blatz founded the Blatz Brewery, which is largely still in existence today, or at least the label is. Hottleman ran the brewery until 1864 and then died in 1866 at the age of 46. Of interest, Hottleman was the great-grandfather of August Schutte, who founded and owned Schutte Brothers Department Store. He married Hattie Hottleman in 1878. Many of you may remember going to the Schutte Brothers Department Store, and I can remember as a kid watching my mother buy things and handing money to them, and it would disappear up this pneumatic chute, and a couple minutes later it'd come back with the right change. It was like magic. I couldn't believe it as a kid. So that was kind of a cool memory for me. Okay, this is a picture here of Fred Coons. In 1864, after Hottleman got out of the brewing business, it was purchased by a fellow by the name of George Coons. And his great-great-nephew, Fred Coons, is standing here next to the Manitowoc Kingsbury Brewery in 1963. I'm showing you this picture because we're going to hear from Fred Coons in just a few minutes. Okay, back in the 1850s, beer brewing was a pretty tough business. There was no automation, there wasn't any pasteurization, no refrigeration, and production was very labor intensive. Beer was put into the sides of hills to keep cold, and it had to be brewed in the winter and then sold in the summer so it wouldn't spoil. So breweries were built on the top of hills. The very largest hill in all of Manitowoc at that time was where Lincoln High School sits today. So that was a brewery before it was Lincoln High School, and it was known as Ref's Brewery. And in fact, that hill was actually twice the size that it currently is. Now, I told you that you were going to be hearing from Fred Coons. Here we go.
Mr. Refs had his brewery up on the hill. We called it a roof's hill, but the name was Refs. He was a Hollander. He had it up on the hill where the Lincoln High School now stands. And as a child, this was a sort of a wilderness up there. We used to go skiing and hunting, and there was part of the brewery left. It looked to me like it might have been part of the boiler room or something. Brick walls were still within the ground, but this was all that was there. It was just it was a small part of the original brewery, and we played in this place. This brewery was located A Street, about where the auditorium of the high school now stands. When the high school was built, in other words, they cut down the hill about 1/2. But at any rate, Mr. Refs also died in 1866, the same year that Mr. Huddleman died. They died within months of one another.
So the Refs Brewery was then sold and became the Wittenberg and Schmidt Brewery, but that was only in existence for 2 years because Albert Wittenberg became the Manitowoc County Sheriff in 1868. So you had the choice between brewing beer or being sheriff. Well, we all pick our path, I guess. I didn't brew in beer, I know that. Okay, as mentioned before, George Coons purchased the brewery from Charles Hoddleman with his partner Kristen Scheibe. They ran the business for 2 years before Scheibe started his own brewery in Centerville. George Coons' cousin Gottfried Coons operated a brewery in Branch. So after George bought the brewery in, would have been 1864, he died 8 years later. And at that point it was sold to a local teamster by the name of Friedrich Pautz. Pautz had a brewmaster there by the name of John Schreihart. Production steadily increased, but then Schreihart in 1879 decided that he wanted to start his own brewery, and by 1883, Pautz had lost his brewmaster and he was bankrupt, and the brewery was foreclosed. And just as a side note, this is the only pictures that I could find of Gottfried Coons and George Coons, and I'm looking at their outfit there, and then I read the caption, and it says that they were part of the IOOF. Just for fun, I decided to look at what the IOOF is. It's the International Order of Odd Fellows. I am not making this up. See, I didn't realize you had to join a club to be considered odd. I thought I was doing a fine job on my own. And I'll tell you what, this summer, I'm driving through Portage. If anybody's ever been to Portage on Highway 33. Again, I'm not making this up. If you look to the right, downtown, there is still an active chapter of the IOOF. Incredible. You learn something new every day, right? Okay, so Louis Coons, who is the brother of George Coons, and John Schreihart then purchased the brewery from Pautz in 1884, and it became Schreihart and Coons Brewers, and it moved to 10th and Washington Street. Schreihart actually owned that building, and it's still there. We drove by it on the way here. If you look on the northwest corner at 10th and Washington, and you look up, it's where the hospice or the home health care place is, you will see a cement heart at the top of the building. Schreihart used a heart as a graphic in a lot of his advertising, and you'll see some of it around here if you look around. So that building is still there, and that was the Schreihart Brewery long ago. Here's kind of an interesting photo of a social singing club, which included Schreihart. He's seated here at the bottom left, and right above him is the before mentioned August Schutte. And the third guy standing, the tall guy with the dark hair, that is Henry Bitz. He founded the company that would become Miro Aluminum. Miro and Kingsbury ended up having a symbiotic marketing relationship later that we'll talk about. It's kind of an interesting history lesson here about how these founding fathers of Manitowoc spent their free time, right? Okay, in 1885, Schreihart decided that he was going to go back to Austria for 5 years. He was going to learn the confectionery or candy business. So he left, and he gave the brewery a 5-year lease to Daniel B. Blazer and Louis Kuhns, and the brewery became Kuhns, Blazer and Company. Their first beer was called Export Lager. So now it's 1890, Schreihart returned, just like he said he would, and basically said, your lease is up, and he booted them out. So with the foresight of pairing beer and chocolate, I don't know, Schreihart seemed like a pretty interesting guy to me. I'd love to have a beer with him. But he came back, took over his building, and resumed operations as the Schreihart Brewing Company. So the game of brewery musical chairs continued, because with their lease expired, Daniel B. Blazer and Louis Kuhns moved over back to 9th and Marshall, which was the old Heidelman Brewery. So both Schreihart and Kuhns, Blazer and Company prospered over the next 15 years. But after nearly 30 years of relative tranquility, serious headwinds developed. World War I was nearing an end, and anti-German sentiment was really strong. By 1918, it was also clear that the Volstead Act was going to be passed, and indeed, Prohibition began in 1920. So small breweries run by German immigrants who could no longer legally brew beer seemed doomed. And it certainly was a death blow to most small brewers nationwide. So let's go back to Fred Kuhns for a minute to describe this fairly dark period of time in Manitowoc brewing history.
The Schreihart Brewing Company operated from then again from 1890. They went back into business, and the Kuhns Blazer and Company brewery operated until Prohibition in 1919, as well as the William Rahr Brewery, William Rahr and Sons Company. When, as I believe I mentioned before, when Prohibition came along, or maybe a year sooner, it was right after the war, World War I, in that period of time, very short period of time. The Rahrs went out of the business. The Rahrs and the John Schreihart brewing interests, and my grandfather Louis Kuhns and Mr. Blazer formed the Manitowoc Breweries Company, and they made near beer. They also, in the old Schreihart plant, they made ice cream and milk, cheese for quite some time.
When Prohibition became official, Manitowoc Brewing Company changed its name to Manitowoc Products Company because, well, there wasn't anything being brewed, right? So Manitowoc Products, out of desperation and on the verge of bankruptcy, acquired a near beer recipe called Kingsbury Pale from a company called Policiers in Winnipeg, Canada, since Prohibition had been the law in Manitoba since 1916. So these folks had a 4-year head start on everybody else making near beer. In the United States, the process of taking alcohol out of beer turned it into a terrible tasting liquid that very few could stomach. The standing joke at the time was whoever named it near beer had very poor aim because it was nowhere near beer. However, Kingsbury Pale tasted very, very good. And also, a little bit of a sidetrack again, if you look closely at the bottle, you may see what appears to be a swastika on it. I've seen in a couple of chat rooms where Kingsbury was criticized because obviously they were run by German immigrants, and they were accused of being obviously Nazi sympathizers. That's a pretty big leap to a conclusion, and it's simply not true. The Nazi Party, who pirated the swastika symbol, wasn't even in existence until 1933, and that symbol has been around for about 400 years. It's actually the Navajo symbol for friendship. So if anybody wants to point out the swastika on a Kingsbury Pale bottle, here's your chance to set them straight. Okay, Kingsbury Pale became wildly popular in the United States. Kingsbury Pale was so successful that Manitowoc Products ended up purchasing the struggling Dutch brewery and the Conrad Schreier brewery in Sheboygan. This was in 1926. And very quickly, they had to add capacity at both of those plants, plus the Manitowoc plant, to fill the demand for Kingsbury Pale. So this was one of the very rare brewery expansions during Prohibition, right? Kingsbury Pale was one of the few beers in the nation to be distributed across the country. The Iowa distributor claimed to have sold 2 million bottles of Kingsbury Pale alone in 1931. Here is Fred Coons again describing the Kingsbury Pale mania.
During Prohibition, they were practically considered in having the top near beer brewed in the United States. I recall distinctly in the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel in, this was in about 1928 or 9, somewhere in that area, that I ordered a bottle of Kingsbury Pale beer in the main dining room and noted that it was priced 10 cents higher than any of the major beers, including Rupert's of New York, Schlitz and Budweiser and that sort of thing. And I distinctly remember calling the maitre d' over and asking him to tell me about this beer. He said it's positively the finest product on the market. And they were, that's why they were getting this premium price.
In 1933, Prohibition ended. So Daniel C. Blazer was now president, having taken over from his father, Daniel B. Blazer. They weren't real creative with names back then. The younger Blazer wanted to capitalize by taking beer nationally, so he renamed the brewery to Kingsbury Brewery since their flagship beer had been Kingsbury Pale. Made sense, right? Immediately, Kingsbury Pale and Kingsbury Ale began to be produced, and Kingsbury's franchise brand became known as the Aristocrat of Beer, and also fit for a king. The company soon found out that the production facilities were not sufficient to keep up with the regional demand, and besides, Blazer had much grander plans than just simply supplying the region. During the summer of 1933, Blazer announced plans to expand his breweries in Sheboygan, and he also exercised options for breweries in Pennsylvania and California so he could produce Kingsbury Ale. So the headquarters of the company would still remain in Manitowoc in an expanded office building, but the reach of the new company was national. Kingsbury listed its stock on the Boston, Chicago, and New York stock exchanges. The idea of a West Coast brewery seemed like the solution to the high cost of shipping beer to California. So at one point, Blazer actually had to deny rumors that the company was preparing to build a $1 million brewery in Los Angeles. It seemed like good times were here for Kingsbury, and the future looked even brighter. Stockholders, sensing an opportunity, now that Prohibition had ended, flocked to buy the stock. The Pauley family, who were very successful local cheesemakers here, became the majority stockholder. Unfortunately, Dan C. Blazer, despite his great business acumen, seemed to have been a victim of his own greed. And he became embroiled in a number of lawsuits. In particular, he was accused of evading taxes by setting up a shell corporation in Delaware. Sounds like kind of like one of our former presidents, but that's a whole other thing. That he had set up to funnel profits from Kingsbury. The company suffered greatly, as did Blazer's health. Also, competition started to increase. Prohibition was over. Here in Manitowoc, the Riverview Brewery operated from 1933 to 1937. It started operations as a new brewery on Water Street along the Manitowoc River, where the post office is currently located. However, most startup breweries had great difficulty obtaining brewing equipment since all the larger breweries snapped up anything that was available, and let's face it, they weren't exactly making a lot of brewing equipment during Prohibition. You also have to remember that in 1933 through 37 was pretty much the heart of the Depression. So as soon as new breweries would pop up, a lot of them failed. Unfortunately, Riverview and their Malt City beer happened to be one of them. Okay, in late 1936, Dan C. Blazer resigned his position at Kingsbury because he wanted to start his own brewery called the Blazer Brewery in Manitowoc, back at 10th and Washington, which was the old Schreihart Brewery. By 1937, Dan C. Blazer's son, Dan C. Blazer Jr., again, not real creative with names, joined the company as treasurer. In November of 1939, Dan C. Blazer, the older Blazer, died at the age of 54. In 1940, the Blazer Brewery entered bankruptcy and reorganization, but by 1943, the Blazer Brewery was defunct and its assets were liquidated. So now Dan Jr. joined the U.S. Air Force in 1943 as a bomber pilot, but unfortunately he was tragically killed in action over Northern Ireland in February of 1944. The American Legion Post, the Drew's Post in Manitowoc, then became the Drew's Blazer Post in 1944 in his memory. Now today, that is where Moore's Irish Pub is. So when you think about it, a guy who died in Ireland was given immortality by having a veterans post named after him, and then had that immortality taken away from him by an Irish pub. I'm thinking the luck of the Irish really didn't apply to this guy. He probably had some questions when he got up to meet St. Peter somewhere. Meanwhile, while everybody else was going out of business, Kingsbury continued to hum along. But the rapid expansion of Kingsbury breweries largely left the Manitowoc plant on 9th and Marshall behind. That brewery had no room to expand, and unlike the two Sheboygan facilities, wasn't located on a railroad spur. So that increased the time and cost to prepare beer for shipment. At first, the Manitowoc Brewery was essential for providing extra capacity for large orders, but most of the production took place at the former Dutch and Conrad Schreier breweries. There was no publicly released figures comparing production between the two, but all the expansion and effort was at the Manitowoc, or the Sheboygan location, and sometime in 1949, operations were shut down at the Manitowoc facility. But the corporate offices remained there until 1963. So the brewery at 9th and Marshall, which still bore the signs of the Coons Blazer era, you can see it on the left-hand side of the picture there. The building was bulldozed back in 1963. The 1960s and 70s, there was a long period of brewing consolidation in the United States. In March of 1959, Kingsbury purchased Sioux City Brewing Company, which at the time was the largest brewery in Iowa. It allowed Kingsbury to expand its distribution to Iowa, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and Minnesota. However, less than a year later, in January of 1960, Kingsbury itself was purchased by Heilemann in La Crosse. Heilemann acquired 51% of the shares by purchasing all the holdings of the Pauley family for about $400,000. And by the way, a grandson of the Pauley family, Grant Pauley, founded Three Sheets Brewery in Sheboygan. So the Pauleys are still active in the brewing industry. The takeover of Kingsbury by Heilemann was actually a very friendly one. They left the management of Kingsbury still in place. And Heilemann's only reason for buying Kingsbury was that they could keep a low-cost beer as a flagship beer without having to develop their own in La Crosse. So Kingsbury was able to stay in business. In fact, Heilemann proposed multiple expansions of the brewery, including one in 1969 to move production of Blatz to the Kingsbury plant. Unfortunately, the brewery nearly closed in 1970. There was a maintenance shutdown, and 93 of the 140 workers were put out of work. There was also a strike in 1971 that lasted 11 days, and that was a contract dispute. So the writing was kind of on the wall, but Kingsbury stuck around for 125th anniversary in 1972. The brewery stayed in production until 1974. They made Kingsbury, they also made Blatz, they also made Drury's beer. However, Heilemann announced that it was closing the 127-year-old brewery for good in February of 1974. Heilemann continued to brew Kingsbury and Kingsbury near beer until 1996 in their La Crosse plant. But then the Kingsbury labels were purchased by Stroh's. Stroh's brewed it for 3 years, but then Stroh's was sold to Pabst in April of 1999. Pabst recognized that the volume of Kingsbury that was being consumed was basically all in Manitowoc and Sheboygan counties. And the cost to brew it just didn't justify the expense any longer. So they decided that they were going to cease production in July of 1999. As a side note, the parent company of Miller Brewing, whoever that might be today, bought the Kingsbury near beer label, but they've never put it into production. Woo, that was a lot of history in a short amount of time. Dang, 150 years. So the next two categories here are much quicker, trust me on that. All right, why did Kingsbury fail? It's really difficult to classify the closure of the Kingsbury Brewery as a failure. Kingsbury wasn't a failure at all. Not only did they survive Prohibition, they flourished and became a national brand for a while. They survived numerous corporate takeovers in the 60s and 70s when most regional brands disappeared. They survived the transition from barrels to bottles to cans. They were just simply caught in a perfect storm. Rising costs, stagnant demand, big brewers swallowing up small regionals, and decades of Kingsbury marketing themselves as a low-price option certainly continued or contributed to their demise. It was the perfect storm for the brand to disappear. And yet the Kingsbury brand continues to endure. As a recovering marketing guy myself, I'm kind of astonished that Kingsbury is still so recognizable in this area. It's a really cool story. And why does the Kingsbury brand endure? Well, I'll tell you what, Kingsbury was and still is a very recognizable brand. These folks were masters at brand marketing before anybody else even knew what brand marketing was. They produced an amazing number of logo items. They stamped their logo on just about everything they could get their hands on. Kingsbury also developed strong local pride as part of its marketing. You may remember bottles, cans, and kegs would come with coupons for points. And you would take the coupons and you put them in these books. Some of you may remember this, right? Yes. And then what you could do once you filled these books is you could redeem them for various household goods, most of which were produced by Miro Aluminum. So what you have is this symbiotic relationship where just about everybody in town either worked for Miro, knew somebody who worked for Miro, or worked at Kingsbury, or knew somebody who worked at Kingsbury. And that created a very deep local pride. And it was just absolutely brilliant marketing for that era. They also developed some very recognizable slogans. So when Kingsbury Pale, which was the near beer, came out, they were known as the aristocrat of them all. When they started brewing actual beer, they were fit for a king. Then they became the aristocrat of beer. And of course, in the early 60s, it was swing to king and roar for more. In the late 60s and 70s, they were brewed with the best. And finally, before they were closed in Sheboygan, it was every drop draft smooth. Okay, these are the condos that I was telling you about in Sheboygan that still utilize the Kingsbury logo. They just changed the word beer for village. So why does the Kingsbury brand endure like this so locally? Let's face it, the beer itself was never considered the best tasting brew ever made, right? But it played an important role in Manitowoc and Sheboygan regions in terms of economy and local pride. People like their beer. They like it uncomplicated. Kingsbury did exactly that. They were simple, they were unpretentious, and they made no bones about the fact that they were a value-priced beer, and that clearly resonated with people in Manitowoc and Sheboygan counties. Just ask the Bud Light folks what happens when you stray from those principles. Okay, time to wrap it up. So let's recap. Kingsbury beer was brewed in Manitowoc for only 16 years, believe it or not, 1933 to 1949. Kingsbury was brewed in Sheboygan afterward, but corporate offices remained in Manitowoc until 1962. They were sold to G. Heileman Brewery in La Crosse in 1960, and the Manitowoc office was raised later that year. The Sheboygan plant closed in 1974. And Kingsbury beer officially ceased July 31st, 1999. I remember it well. I know because it was the last day I cried. Okay, thank you very much for putting up with me for the last half hour. I hope you enjoyed it, and with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ron Schroeder of Pre-Smalting.
A picture of Corey's dad. There's a taking a drink of Kings. That's the usual right there.